Most men do not fall into weakness. They speak themselves into it, not in public, not in defeat, but in quiet, ordinary sentences, repeated until they become identity. I'm just tired. That's not for me. I can't. You feel the weight of something unspoken when you say these things. It is not laziness. It is erosion. Words are not harmless. They carve direction. If you listen closely to how you speak, you will hear the shape of your limits forming. Lesson 1. Most men talk themselves into weakness long before weakness ever arrives. Listen carefully to the way a man speaks. When something demands effort, he rarely declares surrender openly. He reduces himself in fragments. I'm not built for that. I'm just not disciplined. That's too much for me. These sentences seem harmless because they are spoken casually. But repetition is not casual. Repetition is construction. Weakness often begins as vocabulary. A man does not wake up powerless. He narrates his limitations until they feel solid. Each phrase becomes a small permission slip to withdraw. Each complaint becomes a rehearsal for retreat. When pressure appears, the mind reaches for what it has practiced. And what has it practiced? Hesitation, doubt, diminishing language. History has already tested this pattern. Armies collapse first in morale, not in muscle. The same applies to the individual. Before the body avoids the task, the mouth has already excused it. Before the action fails, the sentence has softened it. Consider the difference between saying, "This will be difficult," and saying, "I can't handle this." One acknowledges resistance. The other installs identity. One describes reality, the other defines the self. That difference is subtle. It is also decisive. Why do men do this? Because language feels safer than effort. To declare limitation protects the ego from exposure. If you say you are not capable, you never have to test whether you are. If you label yourself average, you never risk discovering that you demanded too little. Words become a shield against accountability. But the shield corrodes the hand that holds it. When a man repeatedly calls himself undisciplined, unfocused, unlucky, what happens? The mind begins to align behavior with description. Speech sets expectation. Expectation shapes action. Action reinforces belief. And the cycle tightens without noise. Most men believe their weakness is circumstantial. In truth, it is conversational. They narrate fatigue before they are exhausted. They speak of stress before they are overwhelmed. They claim defeat before resistance has even formed. The body listens. The nervous system listens. The identity listens. There is a reason silence feels heavy to undisciplined men. Silence removes the escape of explanation. When you stop speaking weakness, you are forced to confront effort directly. No commentary, no disclaimers, only the task. Ask yourself, how often do you soften your own edge with language? How often do you downplay your capacity before anyone challenges it? Those small remarks are not humor, they are instructions. Time has proven this pattern. The man who controls his tongue begins to control his posture, his choices, his tolerance for discomfort, not because he became stronger overnight, but because he stopped reinforcing fragility through repetition. Weakness is rarely imposed. It is permitted. And permission often sounds like your own voice, speaking quietly, convincing you that retreat is reasonable. Lesson 2. Most men talk themselves into weakness by rehearsing defeat before life ever tests them. Notice how quickly a man predicts his own failure. Before he begins the work, he imagines the outcome. Before he steps into the room, he imagines embarrassment. Before he commits to the discipline, he imagines quitting. The event has not happened, yet the conclusion has already been spoken. He calls it realism, but realism does not require surrender. When a man says, "This probably won't work," he believes he is protecting himself from disappointment. In truth, he is preparing his nervous system to withdraw. The mind obeys rehearsal. If you rehearse collapse, collapse feels familiar. If you rehearse endurance, endurance feels possible. What you practice internally becomes your instinct externally. Consider how often men narrate worst-case scenarios as if they were responsible planning. I'll mess this up. They won't respect me. I always fail at things like this. These phrases appear cautious. They are not cautious. They are predictive commands. The body listens to expectation. Shoulders lower, breath shortens, energy contracts. A man who predicts defeat walks differently before a single obstacle appears. He signals hesitation to himself long before anyone else sees it. Why does he do this? Because predicting defeat creates the illusion of control. If he names the failure first, he believes it cannot surprise him. But surprise is not the enemy. Weakening your own stance is. History has already tested this pattern. Soldiers who assume defeat before battle rarely fight with clarity. They conserve strength for retreat instead of committing it to action. The same dynamic unfolds in daily life. A man who assumes he will fail invests less effort. Less effort confirms failure. Failure validates the original prediction, and the loop closes quietly. Rehearsed defeat becomes identity. There is a difference between acknowledging risk and installing inevitability. A disciplined man recognizes uncertainty without narrating collapse. He does not lie to himself about difficulty. He simply refuses to script his own downfall. Ask yourself how many times you have described a future challenge in terms of your limitation instead of your responsibility. When you say, "I'm bad at confrontation," what are you rehearsing? When you say, "I'm not leadership material," what are you conditioning? Most men never notice the rehearsal because it feels harmless. It happens in small comments, half jokes, passing remarks. Yet, repetition carves deeper than intensity. You do not need dramatic speeches to weaken yourself. You only need consistency. The man who constantly anticipates failure trains his nervous system to shrink from effort. He becomes cautious, not because the world is dangerous, but because his inner narrative is defensive. Life will test you eventually. That is not optional. The only question is whether you have already convinced yourself you will fail before the test even begins. And if you have, whose voice made that decision? Lesson 3. Most men talk themselves into weakness by turning hesitation into identity. There is a difference between feeling uncertain and declaring yourself incapable. Uncertainty is a passing state. Identity is a sentence repeated until it hardens. Many men confuse the two. They experience doubt once, then speak it as a permanent trait. I'm not confident. I'm not built for pressure. I'm just not that kind of man. A moment becomes a label. A label becomes a boundary. Language decides what is temporary and what is permanent. Hesitation is natural. Every man encounters it. The disciplined man treats it as weather. It passes. The undisciplined man names it as character. He says it out loud. He repeats it. He explains it to others. Soon, he is no longer describing hesitation. He is defending it. Why would a man defend his own limitation? Because identity feels stable. Even a weak identity feels safer than uncertainty. If you declare, "I am not decisive," you remove the burden of becoming decisive. You no longer have to test yourself. You have already explained yourself. But explanations reduce tension by reducing ambition. Notice how often men solidify a single experience into a permanent self-definition. One failed attempt at business becomes, "I'm not entrepreneurial." One awkward social moment becomes, "I'm not good with people." One emotional conversation becomes, "I don't handle things like that well." These are not observations. They are conclusions. Quote, "Time has proven this pattern. What a man repeatedly declares about himself begins to shape what he tolerates from himself. If he calls himself undisciplined, he excuses small lapses. If he calls himself impatient, he justifies sharp reactions. The label becomes a permission structure. Hesitation then transforms into a home. The problem is not that he hesitates. The problem is that he installs hesitation as part of who he is. He builds around it. He adjusts expectations around it. He lowers standards around it. And over time, he forgets that the original doubt was temporary. Ask yourself, how many of your limitations began as moments and became identities? How many traits you defend were once just reactions? When you speak about yourself, do you describe effort or do you define capacity? A man who refuses to turn states into identity remains fluid. He can feel fear without naming himself fearful. He can feel unprepared without declaring himself inadequate. He does not deny his experience. He simply refuses to freeze it into self-description. Weakness solidifies through repetition. When you describe yourself carelessly, you carve lines that did not need to exist. And once carved, most men spend years living inside shapes they created with a sentence spoken too soon. Lesson 4. Most men talk themselves into weakness by disguising excuses as realism. There is a tone men use when they want to sound mature about surrender. It is calm, it is reasonable, it sounds balanced. I'm just being realistic. At my age, that's unlikely. That's not how the world works. These sentences carry the weight of wisdom, but often they carry avoidance. Realism does not require retreat. A man who labels his hesitation as realism protects his pride. If he withdraws under the banner of practicality, no one can accuse him of fear. He is not quitting. He is evaluating. He is not shrinking. He is managing expectations. The language is polished. The effect is the same. Why is this so common? Because excuses feel cleaner when they sound intelligent. A crude excuse exposes weakness. A refined excuse hides it behind logic of life. When a man says, "The market is saturated," before he even attempts, what is he really declaring? When he says, "People like me don't get those opportunities," what has he decided in advance? The mind obeys framed conclusions. History has already tested this pattern. Entire generations have justified stagnation by calling it realism. They point to statistics. They reference trends. They cite examples of failure. But realism without effort is simply prediction without participation. There is a difference between assessing risk and preemptively withdrawing. One requires analysis. The other requires language. Most men choose language because it is easier to speak limitation than to confront uncertainty. Excuses spoken calmly still weaken resolve. Observe how subtle this becomes. A man wants to train harder. He says, "With my schedule, that's unrealistic." Another wants to pursue a new path. He says, "That's not practical right now." Another wants to confront someone. He says, "It's not worth the conflict." Each phrase contains a seed of truth. Each phrase also contains a door closing quietly. Weakness rarely announces itself as fear. It presents itself as calculation. Ask yourself when you last labeled your hesitation as wisdom. When you last called your reluctance maturity. How often have you convinced yourself that restraint was prudence, when in truth it was avoidance? A disciplined man does not reject realism. He rejects using it as shelter. He studies constraints without shrinking to fit them. He acknowledges difficulty without bowing to it. Most men reduce their horizon before life reduces it for them. And once that reduction becomes habit, they stop noticing how much of their limitation was self-declared, spoken confidently, defended as intelligent, and never truly tested. Lesson 5. Most men talk themselves into weakness by turning complaint into ritual. A complaint feels harmless. It feels honest. A man finishes a long day and says, I'm exhausted. He faces pressure and says, this is too much. He encounters resistance and says, why does this always happen to me? None of these sentences seem dramatic. Yet, repetition transforms them. Complaint shapes perception. When a man repeatedly describes his life through irritation, inconvenience, and unfairness, he trains his mind to search for friction. The nervous system adapts to that framing. Attention narrows toward obstacles. Effort feels heavier. Even neutral events begin to carry negative weight because the narrative expects them to. Why does complaint become ritual? Because it releases tension without demanding change. Speaking frustration provides temporary relief. The words exit the mouth and the pressure feels lighter. But nothing is strengthened. Nothing is resolved. The energy dissipates instead of concentrating. History has already tested this pattern. Groups that normalize grievance eventually normalize passivity. Individuals who normalize grievance eventually normalize fragility. When complaint becomes language, resilience becomes optional. Ritualized complaint erodes posture. Consider how many men bond through shared dissatisfaction. Work is unfair. The system is broken. The standards are unrealistic. The expectations are excessive. These statements may contain elements of truth, yet repeated daily, they cultivate a subtle withdrawal from responsibility. The problem is not that life is difficult. The problem is narrating difficulty as injustice. When a man frames every challenge as something imposed unfairly upon him, he distances himself from agency. He becomes a commentator on his circumstances instead of an actor within them. Ask yourself how often you describe your effort in terms of burden instead of choice. When you say, I have to, instead of I choose to, what shifts inside you? Language signals whether you stand under pressure or shrink beneath it. A disciplined man does not deny frustration. He simply refuses to rehearse it. He acknowledges fatigue without dramatizing it. He recognizes pressure without personalizing it. Silence in this case is not suppression. It is containment. Weakness grows when irritation is spoken more often than resolve. Most men believe they are simply venting. In reality, they are rehearsing powerlessness in small increments. Over time, that rehearsal becomes their natural tone. And once that tone settles, even opportunity begins to sound like inconvenience. Lesson 6. Most men talk themselves into weakness by repeating phrases until they become character. Repetition is quiet. It does not announce transformation. A man says, I'm not disciplined, once. It feels descriptive. He says it again next week, then again next month. Soon, the phrase no longer describes behavior. It defines him. What began as commentary becomes structure. Repetition solidifies identity. The mind is not impressed by intensity. It responds to frequency. A single bold declaration changes little. A small sentence repeated daily reshapes expectation. When a man consistently describes himself as distracted, unlucky, inconsistent, what is he rehearsing? He is training himself to tolerate those traits. Time has proven this pattern. Water does not shatter stone with force. It reshapes it with persistence. Language operates the same way. Words spoken casually, repeated often, begin to carve the edges of a man's self-perception. Over time, he stops questioning them. Why is repetition so powerful? Because it bypasses resistance. Dramatic statements are examined. Casual ones are absorbed. When a man jokes, I'm terrible with money, he lowers his guard. The sentence slips past scrutiny. It settles. It repeats. Eventually, behavior aligns. Character is shaped by what is tolerated. Each repeated phrase sets a ceiling. If you continually say, I always procrastinate, you prepare the ground for delay. If you say, I lose motivation quickly, you normalize inconsistency. The identity adjusts downward to match the language. Many men underestimate this Because the repetition feels insignificant. It happens in conversations, in self-talk, in private remarks no one else hears. Yet the mind hears everything. The nervous system absorbs patterns. The body adapts to declared limits. Ask yourself what sentences you have repeated about yourself over the years. Which of them have quietly become part of your posture? Which have narrowed your standards without you noticing? A disciplined man does not speak carelessly about his own nature. He may acknowledge flaws, but he does not rehearse them. He corrects behavior without cementing identity. He refuses to make permanence out of temporary weakness. Most men believe their character is the result of experience. In truth, much of it is the result of repetition. What they say consistently about themselves becomes what they expect. What they expect becomes what they permit. And what they permit eventually becomes who they are, not by fate, not by force, but by sentences spoken often enough to feel inevitable. Lesson 7. Most men talk themselves into weakness by confusing silence with suppression and noise with strength. There is a restless impulse in many men to speak immediately when tension appears, to explain, to justify, to react. Words spill out under the illusion of control. If they speak loudly enough, quickly enough, confidently enough, they believe they are asserting strength. In reality, they are often exposing instability. Noise is not authority. When a man feels challenged, he often answers with explanation. He defends himself before he is attacked. He argues before he is questioned. He fills the air with reasons. This constant output feels powerful because it is active. But activity is not the same as control. Why does silence feel uncomfortable? Because silence forces exposure to uncertainty. Without words, there is no shield, no narrative to soften the moment, no justification to lean on. Silence requires posture, and posture requires internal steadiness. History has already tested this pattern. Leaders who speak impulsively reveal more than they intend. Those who pause reveal less and observe more. Silence creates space. Space creates clarity. Clarity preserves strength. Most men mistake immediate response for dominance. They believe if they do not answer instantly, they appear weak. So they rush. They explain themselves excessively. They overstate their intentions. They negotiate their standards out loud. Each unnecessary word reduces their position. Speech without discipline erodes leverage. Consider how often men sabotage themselves by talking through their own doubts. In negotiations, they justify prices before anyone challenges them. In conflict, they confess uncertainty before anyone questions it. In relationships, they over-explain boundaries as if seeking permission. The issue is not speaking. It is speaking without restraint. A disciplined man chooses his words with economy. He does not react to every provocation. He does not clarify what does not require clarification. He understands that silence is not passivity, it is filtration. He allows tension to exist without dissolving it through chatter. Ask yourself how often you speak to reduce discomfort rather than to serve purpose. When you rush to explain yourself, what are you protecting? When you argue to win quickly, what are you afraid will surface in quiet? Most men talk themselves into weakness because they cannot endure the weight of unsaid tension. They believe that if something feels heavy, it must be verbalized. Yet strength often grows in containment. The man who learns to endure silence without panic discovers something unsettling. Much of his previous speech was not communication. It was self-soothing. And self-soothing spoken aloud rarely builds authority. Lesson 8. Most men talk themselves into weakness by outsourcing responsibility through speech. Listen to how responsibility shifts when pressure appears. They didn't give me a fair chance. The timing wasn't right. No one showed me how. Each sentence relocates the center of control. The focus moves outward. The cause moves elsewhere. The self becomes secondary. Blame feels stabilizing. When responsibility is external, the ego remains intact. If the failure belongs to circumstance, the man remains untouched. If the obstacle belongs to others, he remains justified. Language makes this transition smooth. It happens in tone more than volume. History has already tested this pattern. Those who attribute outcomes primarily to external forces rarely adjust behavior. Without ownership, there is nothing to refine. Without refinement, there is no growth. A man who consistently relocates responsibility trains himself to wait instead of act. Words determine locus. Consider the subtle shift between saying, "The meeting went poorly," and saying, "I did not prepare well." The first sentence leaves room for interpretation. The second anchors responsibility. One preserves comfort, the other creates leverage. Why is outsourcing so common? Because accountability requires confrontation with inadequacy. It demands analysis without defensiveness. It demands the ability to say, "I misjudged." Many men prefer explanation over exposure. They would rather appear unfortunate than unprepared. But explanation weakens posture when it becomes default. Over time, a pattern forms. The job was flawed. The market was unstable. The partner was unreasonable. The environment was limiting. Some of these may be true. Yet when every outcome is framed externally, agency diminishes. The man becomes a spectator of his own life. Ask yourself how often your language distances you from outcome. When something fails, where does your sentence point first? Outward or inward? Unquote. The direction matters more than the event itself. A disciplined man does not absorb blame irrationally. He does not ignore context. He simply refuses to surrender authorship. Even when circumstances constrain him, he searches for the element within his control. Not because it is comforting, because it is actionable. Most men weaken themselves not through incapacity, but through narration. They speak as if forces are primary and they are secondary. Over time, the body follows the script. Effort decreases. Initiative slows. Standards soften. Responsibility spoken inward sharpens. Responsibility spoken outward diffuses. And once diffusion becomes habit, strength becomes dependent on conditions instead of character. Lesson 9. Most men talk themselves into weakness through their internal dialogue long before they speak aloud. The most decisive conversations are not public. They occur in silence. A man standing before a difficult task may appear composed, yet internally he negotiates with himself. Maybe tomorrow. This isn't the right moment. You deserve a break. The voice is soft. It sounds reasonable. It sounds protective. Internal language sets the standard. No one hears these sentences. No one challenges them. That is why they are dangerous. A man can weaken himself repeatedly without any witness. He lowers his expectations quietly. He relaxes his commitment subtly. He reframes avoidance as balance. Why does this inner negotiation feel harmless? Because it lacks external consequence at first. There is no immediate penalty for delay. There is no public embarrassment for compromise. 4. But repetition does not require an audience to be effective. The mind absorbs the pattern regardless. History has already tested this pattern. Discipline is not built through public declarations. It is built through private alignment. When internal dialogue is inconsistent, external behavior follows. If a man constantly negotiates downward in his thoughts, he will act downward in reality. You do not rise above your private language. Notice how quickly the internal voice seeks comfort when discomfort appears. It questions necessity. It questions urgency. It questions your own standards. It offers alternatives that preserve ease. And if you accept these suggestions repeatedly, they become expectation. The issue is not self-reflection. Reflection sharpens judgment. The issue is indulgent self-permission, disguised as rational thought. You've done enough. It's not worth the effort. You're not in the right state today. These phrases may occasionally be accurate. Repeated, they recalibrate your baseline. Ask yourself how often you negotiate with your own commitments. When you decide to act, how quickly does the internal voice propose delay? When you set a standard, how often does it propose reduction? A disciplined man monitors his inner speech as carefully as his external words. He does not allow casual compromise to become habit. He does not dramatize effort. He does not exaggerate difficulty. He recognizes the voice of avoidance and refuses to entertain it for long. Most men believe weakness appears in visible action. In truth, it appears earlier. It appears in the tone of internal permission. It appears in the quiet agreements made with comfort. And once those agreements are made often enough, the body simply follows what the mind has already accepted. Lesson 10. Most men talk themselves into weakness by forgetting that authority begins with what they allow themselves to say. Authority is not granted by others first. It is granted internally. A man who speaks loosely about his own standards cannot expect his posture to remain firm. If he says, "It doesn't matter," often enough, nothing will matter. If he says, "Good enough," often enough, mediocrity will settle quietly into place. Standards are enforced through language. Every time a man relaxes his words, he relaxes his frame. When he downplays his commitments in conversation, he signals flexibility where discipline should exist. When he laughs at his own inconsistency, he trains himself to tolerate it. Language either guards the boundary or erodes it. Time has proven this pattern. Men who speak with precision about their commitments tend to follow through, not because they are louder, because they are aligned. Their words are not decorative. They are directives. Consider the difference between saying, "I'll try," and saying, "I will." One preserves escape. The other removes it. One keeps the door open for retreat. The other closes it quietly. The vocabulary a man chooses determines how seriously he takes himself. Why do most men dilute their own authority? Because firm language feels binding. If you declare clearly what you will do, you become accountable to it. If you speak decisively, you limit your ability to adjust without consequence. So many choose softer phrasing to preserve flexibility. But flexibility without backbone becomes drift. A disciplined man understands that his speech is a contract with himself. He does not promise lightly. He does not commit theatrically. He simply chooses words that reflect intention without exaggeration. When he speaks, he listens to himself as if he were someone he must answer to. Ask yourself what your own voice signals to your mind. When you make commitments, do you speak as if they are negotiable? When you describe your standards, do you treat them as suggestions? Most men think weakness is physical or circumstantial. Often, it is linguistic. They reduce their authority sentence by sentence until nothing firm remains. They become adjustable to every mood, every obstacle, every impulse. Strength begins in restraint. It begins when a man chooses language that reinforces discipline rather than excuses it. And when he stops granting himself verbal exits, something shifts. His posture changes. His tolerance for discomfort increases, not because the world softened, but because his words stopped softening him. If this unsettled you, good. That tension is awareness. Most men avoid conversations like this because they prefer comfort over correction. This channel is not built for comfort. It is built for precision. If you value discipline over validation, subscribe. Not for motivation, for refinement. Return only if you are willing to listen carefully to the way you speak and to remove what weakens you. Austere mind.